fellow guests, teachers, and students. Before we begin, I would like to invite you to the dance performance which will be held today at 1 o'clock here in the new auditorium, and the candle lighting ceremony which will be held tomorrow at 10:30 at the old auditorium. I'm honored to introduce Dr. Renee Karp, an English teacher in Vanier, who will be presenting us the subject of Nazification of medicine. Although Dr. Renee Karp is an English teacher, she has a vast background in history of the 20th century. In recent years, she had done freelance work as an editor and translator of the manuscripts on medical issues. She is a member of the American Medical Writers Association. Please welcome Dr. Renee Karp.
Honored guests, colleagues, students, members of the audience, I want to begin my talk today by thanking you, first of all, for this opportunity to address you, and by citing an incident which at first appears to be unrelated to this issue of the Nazification of German medicine and science. Several weeks ago, while teaching one of my English classes here at Vanier College, I was interrupted by a special care counseling student who was working with an intellectually challenged individual. Both young people were collecting waste paper for one of the innumerable recycling programs which go on here at Vanier. And again, only the people really who are part of the Vanier community would know how many recycling programs we have. I made a mental note of how happy both young people seemed. One, the student at Vanier who had gained expertise in working with people with special needs, and the other young person who seemed so happy to accomplish something so simple as to empty a waste paper basket. Now this scene stands out in my mind. I have had time to come back to it many times mentally as I've been preparing the research for this presentation. Let's change our focus now. Instead of being 1995 and instead of enjoying the freedoms of this wonderful country, it is now January 30th, 1933, and Adolf Hitler has just taken the oath of office as Chancellor of the Third Reich. With this act, Hitler and his cohorts assume the reins of power in Germany, and the Nazi worldview is about to permeate every facet of German life. History, for those of you who study history and read history, you know that history teaches us about the military, the social, the political, and the cultural changes which swept over Germany in the 1930s. However, to understand the prominent role which was played by Nazi doctors and by all German physicians in the Nazi experience, we must also understand that German science, too, was reformulated to fit Nazi thought. Hence, the Nazis prided themselves quite literally on what they termed scientific racism. To be fair, let us remember that the 1920s and the 1930s was a period when right-wing ideology and modern science were in a type of flirtation, if not outright courtship. One calls to mind Aldous Huxley and his Brave New World, a novel which I myself have sometimes taught in English classes. Well, those of you who have read it know that all of a sudden the possibility of creating test tube babies was becoming a cogent metaphor. And of course, from this idea of test tube babies and notions of cloning, we are getting dangerously close to the idea of using science to create some sort of master race. Even in the United States, by the way, the idea of putting science to use to alter heredity, to intervene in heredity, was in vogue. And there were many advocates of compulsory sterilization for those who were deemed criminally insane or somehow genetically inferior. In fact, By 1920, some 25 American states had enacted laws providing for such sterilization of the genetically inferior. An institute designated exclusively for the study of eugenics existed at Cold Spring Harbor, New York, and was funded incidentally by the prestigious Carnegie Foundation. It is important to note that German scientists not only embrace this emerging study of eugenics, and again, those of you who study biology and chemistry here probably know that eugenics is the principle of strengthening one particular biological group, supposedly on the basis of some ostensible worth. Okay, so the German scientists were not only embracing this idea, but they were giving this notion a particularly ominous and excessive tone of their own. In fact, for certain German scientists, the whole notion of eugenics, or the selective breeding and strengthening of one group, with its emphasis on sterilization of the so-called inferior beings which it entails, became a kind of sacred mission. In 1917, for instance, Fritz Lenz, a German physician geneticist, an advocate of sterilization, had written that, and I quote, "Race is the criterion of value." Furthermore, he went on to write that the state is not there to see that the individual gets his rights, but rather to serve the race, the Volk. By the 1920s, Professor Lenz was proclaiming that without a radical eugenics policy, again I quote, "our Nordic race is doomed to extinction." In 1924, Hitler himself had written thus in Mein Kampf, declaring the sacred racial mission of the German people to be assembling and preserving the most valuable stocks of basic racial elements, and slowly and surely raising them to a dominant position. Consequently, within 6 months of assuming the office of the Chancellery, this Nazi racial biomedical vision began to permeate every facet of medical and scientific praxis in Germany. On June 22, 1934, Wilhelm Frick, Hitler's Minister of the Interior, introduced a sterilization law declaring that Germany was in danger of Volkstod, which literally translates as the death of the people or the death of the nation. Anyone who was deemed life unworthy of life was to be sterilized. And included in this Nazi category were the hereditarily sick, an estimated 200,000 people with schizophrenia, 80,000 manic depressives, 20,000 people with epileptics, 60,000 people with Huntington's chorea, 600 individuals who had suffered hereditary blindness, 4,000 approximately suffering from hereditary deafness, and approximately 16,000 other Germans who suffered from various bodily malformations. In short, a projected 410,000 individuals were slated for surgical sterilization, with this being understood within the Nazi hierarchy that this was but a very modest beginning. Now, what is significant in all this is that it reveals, even at this early stage of Hitler's regime, two extremely frightening elements. The first is the ease with which Nazi thinking could insinuate itself into German medicine and German science. The second is the notion that some people are not worthy of living, life unworthy of life, or as the Germans called this category, lebensunwerten Lebens. Now, the average German more or less accepted this premise. Indeed, in some of the studies which I have read, it became apparent that although the Catholic Church felt very uncomfortable with this sterilization process, the desire to avoid a political confrontation with Hitler's regime was so great that the Church merely requested that Catholic doctors and Catholic clergy not be required to serve on the hereditary health courts which were sprouting throughout Germany to consider potential cases for sterilization. Now, the process of the Nazification of German medicine and science proceeded rapidly. As I have already mentioned, hereditary health courts were springing up everywhere. Now, these were composed of 3 members, 2 physicians, one of which was really a kind of administrative health officer, likely to enjoy close affiliation with the Nazi Party, and the other was a district judge. Again, this person would be likely to be close to or at least in tune with the aims of the regime. So as you can see, the composition of these courts virtually guaranteed that they would function as little more than a rubber stamp for the Nazi biomedical vision. In addition to this program of enforced sterilization, the process of the Nazification of German medicine and science made important forays on many fronts. The year 1935, of course, saw the enactment of the infamous Nuremberg Laws. The Nazi vision of racial Nordic purity began to take shape. Not only was intermarriage between Aryan and Jew, or any other one, outlawed, not only were Jews forbidden any economic, social, or political contact with Germans, but of course the universities, and this is very essential, the universities and the professions were to rid themselves of Jews and of course Jewish influences. Now what interests us here, of course, is the medical profession particularly, in which large numbers of Germany's Jews had made their contributions since Enlightenment times. No longer were Jewish doctors permitted to treat Aryans, but Jewish physicians were stripped of their hospital affiliations and their ability to fill prescriptions for even their Jewish patients. However, what is really important to note is the fact that the Judaization of medicine, as Hitler termed it, was to be rooted out. Judaism, of course, teaches compassion for the individual. It teaches empathy with human suffering. The great Jewish physician and philosopher Maimonides had written an oath for the practitioner, which of course stands with that of Hippocrates. Hitler understood this, and he sought to replace the concept of the physician as healer, the physician as someone who tends to those in need. He felt that this was the pernicious work of Jewish influence throughout Western civilization. So he sought to change this concept of the physician healer to a new Nazi definition of the physician. I now quote from a 1932 article written by a Dr. Arthur Gett in the Nazi Party Medical Journal, which was entitled Ziel und Weg, Aim and Road. I quote, "It is the supreme duty of the state to grant life and livelihood only to the healthy and the hereditarily sound portion of the population in order to secure a hereditarily sound and racially pure Volk for all eternity." And so the doctor, the scientist in Nazi Germany, was to become transformed, like everyone else in Germany, into something hardened. The doctor was to shed his Jewish influence. An influential medical academic, Dr. Rudolf Rahm of the University of Berlin, was an example of the zealousness and enthusiasm of many science and medical practitioners as they prepared to shed their pernicious Jewish influences and to become the ideal Nazi practitioners. Rahm wrote that each doctor was no longer to be a caretaker of the sick, but, and I quote Dr. Rahm, a cultivator of the genes and a physician to the Volk. As well, Dr. Rahm coined the rather interesting term biological soldier, who must abandon the liberal spirit associated especially with the harmful influences of the Jews in our profession. What seems even more incredulous is that so many learned men of science eagerly embrace the Nazification of their profession. As Victor von Weizsäcker has written, for quite a number of doctors, Hitler not only had the power of a commander-in-chief in a political sense, but he was also thought of as the highest-ranking physician. Aside from the Nazi diehards within the medical profession, to whom these images of cultivator of genes and biomedical warrior held special fascination, many German doctors and scientists, like their counterparts in other professions, simply had a lot to gain by removing their Jewish colleagues. In large pre-war German cities, Jewish physicians might constitute up to 50% of the total number of physicians. Even though they comprised only 30% of all doctors in Germany, even this figure was far above the overall percentage in population. And of course, beyond even the figures, the great prominence and the international repute enjoyed by many German Jewish scientists as a result of their scientific accomplishments constituted a festering source of jealousy. By 1936, in fact, the German medical profession had become sufficiently de-Judaized, both in terms of spirit and practice, for the leaders of the Third Reich to embark on the first of their many killing in the name of healing the Volk projects. In other words, the euthanizing of young children, German children, who had been born with deficits. Dr. Gerhard Wagner, a close friend of Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Karl Brandt, became the spokesman of this ambitious project, which was known as Project T4 to the German bureaucracy. In 1936, Dr. Wagner held discussions with a small circle of friends, specifically high-ranking officials and SS colleagues, about killing idiotic children and killing the mentally ill. Dr. Wagner even displayed a creative side to his personality, suggesting that a film be made in an institution to demonstrate how worthless these people were. And of course, the idea of using the upcoming war as a subterfuge to justify this type of killing, and to make it palatable to the German people, this was already evident in these discussions, copious notes of which have been left to historians. So by 1938, the policy of euthanizing children was well underway in Germany. A group of medical consultants sympathetic to the plan helped the political leadership establish the Reich Committee for the Scientific Registration of Serious Hereditary and Congenital Diseases. Midwives were required to fill in reports at the time of birth for any child who was born showing signs of the following: Mongolism, microencephaly, malformations of any kind, especially of the limbs, the head, the spinal column, paralyses, and spastic conditions. An initial facility for killing these children was established at Gordon. And of course, the Nazis used a euphemism for this kind of killing, a euphemism which was to become too well known for generations to come. They referred to this euthanasia as Behandlung, or treatment, and the questionnaire and documentation on which the killing orders were filled in had a column on the right side which was marked Behandlung. In fact, the Nazi physicians who rubber-stamped these forms were often swamped by the paperwork. And so a simple plus or minus sign, much in the way teachers will put an A+ or a B- on a paper, this would suffice to indicate the Behandlung in question. So human life had come to be valued as a simple plus or minus on a piece of paper. In October 1939, with a simple Führer decree, the project of killing children, or Project T4, was extended to the killing of adults. Now this is a watershed, because at this point, it becomes absolutely clear that extensive killing is a principle central to the Nazi biomedical vision. Furthermore, this far-reaching killing project would necessitate the involvement of virtually the entire German medical establishment. Consequently, Dr. Herbert Linden of the Reich Health Ministry and Dr. S. Gravitz, who was chief physician of the SS, actively set about recruiting other doctors for leadership role models. Particularly, they looked to the universities. They wanted to get the young doctors involved, the young graduates involved in this killing program. Furthermore, 6 additional killing facilities, Hartheim, Sonnenstein, Grafnik, Bernburg, Brandenburg, and Hadamar, were added. These were, for the most part, converted asylums or isolated nursing homes where busloads of patients could be unloaded quietly and without much public interest or disturbance. It was the Brandenburg facility which won the dubious honor of being the place where the first experiments with gassing, initially carbon monoxide gas, were carried out. I want to quote now from a book entitled The Nazi Doctors by Dr. David Lifton. The arrangement included a fake shower room with benches, the gas being inserted from the outside into water pipes with small holes, through which the carbon monoxide could escape. Present were 2 SS chemists with doctoral degrees, one of whom operated the gas. The other, a Dr. August Becker, told how 18 to 20 people were led naked into the shower room. Through a peephole, he observed that very quickly people toppled over or lay on benches, all without scenes of commotion. The room was ventilated within 5 minutes. SS men could then use special stretchers which mechanically shoved the corpses into crematory ovens without contact. Let us pause for a moment. I think that we are all aware that the model was here, a model which was to become all too infamous to the 20th century and all too infamous for posterity. Let us consider these questions. What was the role of the doctor in these expanded killing projects? What role did the doctors play in the cover-up of this euthanizing of thousands of Germans? And finally, how was the step taken from the supposed euthanizing of the genetically inferior German nationals to the mass genocide carried out at Auschwitz and Sobibor and Treblinka and so on? Well, doubtless the role of the doctor in Hitler's Germany had been utterly transformed, and it certainly had become de-Judaized. From the embodiment of healing, from the idea of using science to heal and to discover potential benefits for mankind, the Nazi physician had evolved into the embodiment of killing. Testimony of many German physicians given at the Nuremberg medical trials generally corroborated the following. Senior doctors made policy and rendered decisions, much in a kind of consultative role, but the younger doctors were made to do the actual killing. A case in point was a Dr. Karl Eberl, who was only 29 years old when he learned to operate the gassing mechanism at Brandenburg. Another young medical graduate, 26-year-old Dr. Aquilin Ulrich, assisted Dr. Eberl and later testified at Nuremberg that he had to make a superficial examination of naked patients in the anteroom of the gas chamber. He recalled having wondered and having thought that such an examination was inexplicable, since he had been told that all these patients were slated to die. Only subsequently did he come to realize that such an examination was part of the overall medical deception. That is, it was used to calm the patients or to camouflage the mass killing that was going on. Another young doctor who gave testimony at Nuremberg about his experience at a killing facility indicated that he had been informed by a physician, that if he worked in one of these facilities, physicians, according to the law, had the last say, and therefore had to re-examine the arrivals, presumably to see if any should be saved. Now, this 25-year-old doctor said that when attempting to exercise this medical prerogative to intercede on behalf of a patient, he was informed by a senior Dr. Nietzsche that these were but pro forma examinations before the death chamber, and that they were to serve mainly to calm the patients, and, this was extremely interesting, to calm the conscience of young doctors like himself who had to carry out the killing. For the most part, then, these examinations consisted mainly of the doctor verifying the fact that the patient and the chart coincided. That is, that the right person was being killed. And using the occasion to help decide which false diagnosis would be most appropriate for the death certificates that were soon to be issued. This leads us to our second question. What role did the doctors play in the medical cover-up, given that each death certificate had to be falsified? Now, the answer here, too, is that the doctors were essential in perpetrating the medical cover-up of the killing. Each killing center had a special office, again, testimony to the Nazi love of bureaucratic accuracy, known as the Special Registry Office, where a suitable date of death and, of course, a suitable cause of death would be manufactured by compliant doctors. The process of cover-up went something like this. Younger doctors would be given lists of probable causes of death. Now, these were a type of written or typewritten guideline, much in the manner that teachers will give students guidelines or notes. These guidelines would specify important details about a disease, details which would be needed to maintain consistency. The guidelines would then indicate or suggest to the doctor how many days to allow for a certain condition to develop. For example, if you were going to say that such and such an individual had died from septicemia, they would sort of get a kind of biology and medical review. They were told to allow 4 to 5 days for septicemia to set in, and then, of course, septicemia takes an additional 5 days during which the illness ravages the patients, and accordingly, they would work out 9 days and come up with a suitable date of death. The guidelines would also often specify which treatments to mention in the death certificate, treatments which supposedly had been tried unsuccessfully, all with a view to deceiving the families of the victims. The road from killing Project T4 to the death camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka was unfortunately a straight and easy one to follow for German doctors in the Third Reich. And they did indeed travel that shameful road in droves. Yet, without understanding how German medicine and science had succumbed to the Nazi biomedical vision, one might think that Dr. Joseph Mengele, the infamous Auschwitz camp doctor who was also known as the Angel of Death, was an exception, an aberration of some sort. But he wasn't. He was symptomatic of an entire generation of medical graduates. In fact, in allowing their profession to fall under the spell of Hitler and his cohorts, in embracing the Nazi vision of an Aryan master race which must cleanse itself of the so-called genetically inferior, in de-Judaizing itself by rejecting the Jewish humanism which had influenced Western medical practice from the time of the great Jewish practitioners and philosophers like Isaac Judaeus and Maimonides on, and in failing to mount any meaningful opposition to the slaughter of German children who had been born with deficits, and eventually to adult German nationals who fell within the criteria of Project T4. The German medical establishment had indeed transformed itself into an infamous spawning ground for enthusiastic young Mengeles. It is not my intention here to describe every atrocity in which the doctors and the scientists of the Third Reich engaged against millions of Jews and Gypsies and other victims of the death camps. Rather, in the time remaining, I would simply like to communicate some overall outlines and generalizations which will help to demonstrate how essential the German scientists and doctors were to the entire process of genocide. The first, and I believe the most essential point to understand, is that doctors were not peripheral, nor were they accidental to the death camps. Instead, they were central figures who participated at every level of the killing. Administratively, for example, the doctors were second in command, as for instance the young Dr. Edvard Wirch, who was second in command to the Auschwitz Gestapo chief Maximilian Grabner. The infamous ramp selections were the first level killing act in which the doctors engaged. In fact, the selections were run by the doctors, and when they were not available, by the camp dentists. Research reveals an interesting irony. In September 1942, when the young Dr. Edvard Wirch arrived at Auschwitz to assume his duties there, the selections were being done by SS officers. Dr. Wirch, however, initiated an interesting, and I feel extremely revealing, bureaucratic controversy. He wrote back to Berlin immediately, and he argued that the camp doctors, those with a training in science, should be the ones doing the selecting of who should live and die, not the SS staff, since in Wirch's view, too many healthy people were being sent straight off to the gas chambers. Wirch argued that only physicians, after all, people with a good scientific education, had the real skills and training to differentiate between the sick and the healthy. And so, after a certain amount of bureaucratic feather ruffling, the ramp selection duties, were wrestled away from the SS, and they devolved upon the doctors. Now, what is ironic here, and I think really revealing, is the horrible awareness which Wirth is unconsciously demonstrating. That is, that the Reich physician had the best qualifications to become the expert killer. Dr. Edvard Wirch unknowingly demonstrated for history the ironic horror of Nazism. In other words, that science, that knowledge, that precise skill, all embodied, of course, in the persona of the physician or scientist, or the biological warrior, if you like. All of these skills can be used to perfect a system of genocide. Now, what is extremely noteworthy in Wirch's power struggle with the SS is that he and his physician colleagues all descended to the same level, really, and all accepted the same fundamental goals of the SS, namely that the killing of innocent men, women, and children is all right. In claiming prerogative over the ramp selections, the doctors were only trying to perfect the system of genocide by making sure that those who were too weak or too sick to work were dispatched immediately, while anyone else who could still serve the slave labor needs of the IG Farben company. They set up a plant for the manufacture of synthetic rubber right next door to Auschwitz, or the Krupp Coal Works, or the Siemens Stuttgart electrical parts plant. Also, they were vying for territory very close to Auschwitz. So anybody who could still serve the slave labor needs were permitted to live a little longer, and the average was something like 3 months. Again, at the Nuremberg medical trial, testimony revealed that all camp doctors did participate in the ramp selections. Some testified to their initial distaste at having to order so many men, women, and children off to their deaths. However, they indicated that heavy drinking sessions and, of course, the paternal camaraderie of other doctors and scientists soon helped them to allay their initial qualms. And, of course, some, like the young Dr. Joseph Mengele, seemed, from all accounts, to relish the ramp selections. The entire killing process carried out at Auschwitz and the other camps was done with the same medical cover-up and duplicity which we have already identified as features of the T4 projects. For instance, the Zyklon B gas, developed by German chemists, was transported to the gas chambers in trucks which had huge Red Cross markings on them. The SS drivers of these trucks wore white lab coats. These logos served a dual purpose, and I'm sure that we've often wondered about these logos. How could death be transported in a car which had a Red Cross marking on it? Well, on one level, of course, this was intended to calm or to dupe the victims who were supposedly being led off to their showers. But on another level, and this is extremely intriguing, these logos served to calm the consciences of the doctors turned killers. The doctors really began to believe in this myth that they were treating the Volk, that is, restoring the health of the German race by exterminating the diseased elements of Europe which threatened it, in particular the Jews, but also, to a lesser extent, gypsies, homosexuals, Slavs, communists, anybody who fell into any kind of category that they didn't like. In fact, the literature of National Socialism is replete with these images of Jews and homosexuals and communists as being disease carriers or spreaders of typhus and vermin. And of course, what must a physician do but to restore his patient's health, but to stamp out and eradicate the disease? So as you see, the medical metaphor, bolstered by these trappings of medical symbolism and mock examinations, this medical metaphor was being played out at the camps and was being used as a psychological morphine for both the victim and the victimizer. There remains but one other facet of the German doctors' complicity in genocide to discuss, and that is, of course, the notorious medical blocks in which inhumane experiments were performed on prisoners. Again, most of us don't really understand the context in which these atrocities were carried out, a context which by no means excuses them or the perpetrators, but at least when understood, provides some insight into the internal logic of the madness of fascism. The death camps, of course, provided the German medical establishment with an inexhaustible pool of human guinea pigs on which the strangest and the most bizarre notions of racial politics could be enacted. Again, the entire German scientific establishment, which had embraced the Nazi view of racial biology through the official body known as the Reich Office of Racial Biology at the Berlin Dahlhelm Institute, spearheaded and funded much of the so-called research, and as such must bear responsibility. The experiments carried out on the prisoners really had very little, if any, scientific value, because the research from its inception was meant somehow to prove the superiority of the German people and to advance the cause of Nazism. And as many of you in the audience, I assume many of you are in the science areas, as you know, when you start out with faulty premises, okay, and you fix the research, as it were, you're not really going to get very much out of the experiment, which is going to be of great use. Allow me to illustrate this point. Dr. Mengele was carrying on so-called research into twin births, an idea which in fact he had stolen from a former medical professor, a Dr. Verschauer, who was always interested in studying the laws of heredity on man, particularly with a view, of course, to showing that Jews and Slavs had a very high proportion of adverse hereditary influences. So Mengele carried on this idea. He was present, or he tried to be present, at every transport of arrivals, and he was constantly looking for twins. Witnesses recount how he would go around screaming, "Zwilling aros," or "twins come forward." And he wanted to collect twins. Little boys, little girls, adolescents, older sets of twins. It is estimated that he had, at one time, over 300 twins, mainly of Jewish or Gypsy origin, in his collection. So he kept them in a separate compound. He would measure them, he would feed them sometimes the same foods, different foods, then he would examine them again. Sometimes he would kill both and dissect the internal organs, or sometimes he would kill one of the twins and let the others live. There seemed to be no rhyme or reason to his methodology. And of course, in the end, no real scientific import was gained from his data, except perhaps to show us to what a bestial level a man's mind can descend. Similarly, Mengele carried on work with a view to altering heredity and changing eye color. You guessed it, in a decidedly Aryan fashion. He would send the eyes of gypsies, he used gypsies for this, the gypsies who had been killed by phenol injections, he would send their eyes back to the Berlin Delholm Institute, where a study was being carried on into the hereditary factors of eye color. And again, Mengele would hunt through every transport for children who arrived at Auschwitz, but he wanted children who had blonde hair and brown eyes, because he wanted to see if he could change brown eyes to blue eyes. And he tried doing this by injecting methylene blue. Some of the chemists in the audience, of course, would tell you that that is a relatively common blue dye. After a period of so-called scientific observation, during which the children seemed to develop inflammations of the eyes, but usually nothing more serious than that, he would then send some or all of the children off to be gassed. Again, what barbarity and what scientific quackery. Nor were Mengele's experiments the only examples of barbarity coupled with scientific obscenity. We have probably all heard of the camp doctor's work on hypothermia. That consisted of throwing Russian POWs into freezing vats of water in order to see how long they would survive. Again, this so-called research was inspired not really by a physician or a scientist, but by Hermann Goering, who was concerned in his capacity as commander of the Luftwaffe. He was concerned about losing Luftwaffe pilots in the cold North Sea, and he wanted to see if it was worthwhile trying to get any of them, how long that would be feasible. However, the atrocities, which to my mind were really the most fearful, and which illustrate the lowest level of barbarity to which Germany's scientific establishment stooped, were the experiments on sterilization perpetrated on both male and female prisoners. The internal logic of these medical atrocities is indeed terrifying, for it was the great ambition of the death camp doctors to find a cheap, efficient way to sterilize masses of people, because this was going to be the magic bullet, if you want, the magic formula by which the Reich could dominate and control Europe's populations for thousands of years. Many doctors participated in this research. In fact, there was a kind of competition, very much in the way teams of researchers compete for Nobel Prizes, even nowadays. And I was quite amazed to learn about this. But there were teams working in separate concentration camps because each team wanted to be the one to find the magic bullet for sterilization. Many doctors participated in this research, but one in particular besmirched himself so and his previous accomplishments that I feel I must mention him. Dr. Karl Klauberg was already a physician and a gynecologist of some international repute when, in 1933, he joined the Nazi Party and became a committed fascist. Now, Klauberg, as I said, was a gynecologist and a lecturer at the University of Kiel. By the age of 39, he had developed two hormonal preparations, progenin and prolutin, which I again assume that the chemists in the audience would know about. And these two solutions are still used today to treat infertility. He also developed what is known as the Klauberg test for measuring the action of progesterone. And I'm told that that too is still used today and is still taught in medical schools. However, so ambitious was Klauberg, so cynical, and so corrupted by the warped Nazi biomedical vision that he jumped at the opportunity to meet SS leader Himmler, who essentially arranged for Klauberg to have access to as many prisoners as he wanted for his so-called research. This eventually culminated in Klauberg's block, which was also known as the infamous Block 10 at Auschwitz, where Klauberg and his assistant, a Dr. Johann Goebel, no relation to the propaganda minister Goebbels, this is where they were experimenting with injecting formalin into the uterus of women. They also were testing the idea of using X-rays for mass sterilization. By the way, Klauberg seemed to share in the Nazi penchant for euphemisms, for he referred to his barbarous work in sterilization as positive population policy, and he was planning to deliver a great scientific paper on positive population policy. There is little point in continuing further. We may, I think, conclude by reinforcing some major themes, namely that the entire German medical establishment proved itself very willing to embrace the racial biomedical vision of Hitler and his Nazi ideologues. Furthermore, in so doing, the German medical and scientific community not only de-Judaized itself in spirit and in practice by ousting significant numbers of its Jewish practitioners, but this establishment forsake the great healing traditions and responsibilities enunciated by Western scientists from the time of Hippocrates and Maimonides and Galen on. The physicians of the Third Reich were learned men. They were literate. For the most part, they were skillful, and they were university trained. Yet, how easily corrupted. If men who are entrusted with the lives of others can so readily embrace evil, what does this then tell us about all men? In my view, the greatest shame is that the German medical establishment of the 20s and 30s embraced Nazi ideology with virtually no opposition. Even when the occasional professor, and there were some, or the occasional physician voiced some opposition in the early stages of the T4 killing projects, the criticism was usually directed at the methodology used in the killing. In fact, there was great discussion as to whether it is better to kill by gas or by phenol injection and so on. But they never really addressed the ethical issue of the killing itself. Little wonder, then, that the Nazi doctors figured so prominently at every level of the death camp genocide. Little wonder that the doctors and the scientists of the Third Reich forever shamed their most honored professions. In reading about this nightmare known as the Third Reich, particularly in researching the evil which the physicians and the scientists facilitated and perpetrated, I have really come to appreciate the significance of that famous quotation from the book of Proverbs. He who saves one life in Israel saves the world entire. When the first German doctor killed but one patient, he was well on his way to killing the world entire. And when the first scientist misuses science, he too is well on the way to killing the world entirely. Thank you. Questions? Any questions? I'd be happy to take them. Kind of a sobering bit of information. I'd just like to add one other thing, actually, that I'll throw out at you and at some of my colleagues who are here who teach in the sciences. In the research I've been doing, I found out that it was actually the German medical establishment which furnished the greatest numbers of party adherents. In other words, students in the universities who were training to go into law didn't join the Nazi Party in as large numbers as the medical students. Students who were studying to become teachers didn't join. They weren't so keen on it. But unfortunately, the students in medical school, the students in chemistry, the ones who seemed to be very regimented and were very fact-oriented, they joined in the largest numbers in the early years of the party in 1933, 1934, 1935. And when I was reading that, I was really struck by that because, of course, I teach in an area which I consider to be an area in which I like to, which really the key thing is to make my students think about life, about the relationships between themselves and others. And I know my husband, who is, for example, a physician, and I've heard this from many physicians, have said that medical schools never used to concern themselves very much with that. It's how well you did in chemistry or biochemistry or physiology that counted. You weren't taught to ask too many questions. And I don't know, I just sort of want to throw that out because I really think that's important for teachers, for my colleagues in the sciences to understand that if we're just training excellent technicians, we're not really doing a very good job. I think that has, there is an awareness, a growing awareness about the ethical issues now that was lacking certainly 20 years ago and 25 years ago. And I could see where German education particularly, this was probably the situation. So I'm just throwing it out at you. I should make a science teacher respond.
On that note, I'd like to ask you and scientists generally, maybe it's too big of an issue to talk about it. Doesn't it all begin with animal vivisection?
Well, I can't answer that, but I can see that, that is sort of, it definitely is a related issue. I mean, how far are we willing to go? Can scientific advancement and research, can it take place if we're not going to, what parameters are we going to have? What kind of experimentation are we going to do? How sensitive do we have to be to this? I don't know because I don't work directly in the field, and I think it must be very difficult. Recently, someone who was a professor of physiology was talking with me, and she was saying, well, of course, what do you expect? When somebody has to plunge a scalpel in, you do, to a certain extent, have to have taught them ahead of time to turn themselves off. I don't know. I'm only relating this woman's comment. But, definitely, that's certainly there, and it's an issue which doesn't follow too far behind.
Just like to congratulate you.
Oh, thank you.
That was a wonderful presentation. I'm speaking to the point that was mentioned in the Gazette recently, I believe only about a week ago, that in fact massive sterilization policies are utilized in China, and that they are currently planning to extend it to the handicapped, and the whole list of handicaps that are going to qualify for sterilization hasn't yet been finalized. So I think that we shouldn't think these things are in the
Absolutely.
past. That's what I'm saying. Because
Absolutely.
Right now, if we look at China, for example, and who knows what else.
Absolutely, and I think that's an excellent comment. Even in our own society, we've just sort of come through the Tracy Latimer issue, and I don't want to sort of, raise it. I'm not all that well informed, but I think there are questions of euthanasia, which we're hearing more and more about. We're obviously in a situation where societies have strained allocations and strained resources. And whenever we're in a situation of strained resources, people will look around and ask the question and start saying, really, how long are we going to keep this person on a respirator? Do we really want these people? They don't seem to be pulling their own weight. And I think that these are really very dangerous issues. We don't realize that we don't realize that all this is not dead and gone. It's an ideology, which is surfacing and resurfacing. There are many implications of this. I think there are many implications for students nowadays too. I try to emphasize the point that many of the people who seem to be in the foreground, who sort of adopted and embraced this, were young people, largely also because there was a lot of silent and sometimes not such silent condoning going on by people in authority, their professors, their teachers. And, nowadays, it's always, I like to see my students questioning. And I like to see my students, for example, this semester I am teaching many people who happen to be in the special care counseling program. And I've come to learn a lot about what they do. And I'm finding young people here in the college who are extremely sensitive, who are extremely aware of these kinds of issues. I know some of them are in the audience because I just had class with them earlier. And I think in general, I think that kind of dialogue and awareness and the whole goal of education as being sort of a kind of monitoring and questioning and ethical-based education, that is something that really must be worked into all areas of the curriculum. Because as you say, issues like this, they're not dead and gone. If anything, they are emerging and taking on different forms, especially because we now have such advanced technologies. We do have, the possibility for test tube babies, as it were, in vitro fertilization, and a lot of issues which are creeping up. When is somebody dead? How long do we keep people on respirators and so on? So if anything, the issues are becoming more complex, and I think sometimes more painful and more fuzzy. And that's why people's individual sensitivities have to be more finely tuned than ever. Part of the way of becoming finely tuned is by knowing the past also, know where excess can step in. But as you say, these issues are, alive and well. Anybody else? No? Okay. Thank you for listening.